like we should all have one of those little bracelets. What would George Moses Horton do? You know, he would find allies and he would step up and say something.
Welcome to Empowering Leadership, a podcast from Dorrier Underwood. Join us as we explore new perspectives on leadership and discover what it takes to be effective as a leader. Here's your host, Doug McVadon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Empowering Leadership podcast. My guest today is author Marjorie Hudson, and Marjorie's new book, Indigo is just out, and we'll, of course, be talking about that. But first, I want to say that, Marjorie, I found out that in addition to your writing, you're also on a mission. And that's really where I want to start my conversation with you. So hello and welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thanks. It's good to be here.
I think that when I thought about doing this interview with you as a fledgling writer myself, I was going to ask you a lot of questions about writing. But then when I found out about the other writer beside yourself that you like talking about, I was, more than intrigued. So why don't you go ahead and dive right in and tell me about George Moses Horton, whom, in many ways you discovered, at least for people like me.
Yes, that's interesting. I discovered him in plain sight. He was there all along. So George Moses Horton, he was the first Black man to publish a book in the South. And in fact, he published two, and he published both of those while living in slavery. And then he published a third after he gained freedom at age 68.
It's got to be a remarkable story right there, because I just can't imagine what it would involve to publish two books while being enslaved. But there's more to it than that, right?
Yes, there is. Here's a man who knew how to find allies. He was determined to find a way to be free, even while living as an enslaved person. So the interest for me partly is that he lived in Chatham County, very near where I live, that he was a poet. And when I first heard about him myself, or stumbled over him rather than discovered, I learned he was a poet. I was a poet at the time. I learned he sold poems at the farmer's market. I was working at a farmer's market, and I began to identify with him, which is, a very probably a preposterous thing to do as a white woman of privilege. But he speaks to all of us in his life. He's just an inspiring person. And he changed my life with his story and how I responded to it.
So let's find out how you stumbled across him, because as you characterized it, you discovered him in plain sight. So tell us the story of how you came to know anything about him. Well, and for disclosure to our listeners who are, of course, all over the world, we're in North Carolina and you're in North Carolina. When you say Chatham County, you mean Chatham County, North Carolina, which is in the northern central part of the state. And Dorrier Underwood, my company, is based in North Carolina, in Charlotte and Raleigh. And so this is a local story for us, but it's a universal story, as I think you'll find out.
Yes, it surely is. And history, I learned that history is local. And I learned that what white people know about history and what Black people know about history is two different things. And how it happened was I was leading a class in my daughter's 8th grade history class. And I had just learned a little bit about George Moses Horton from a journal where I had also been writing. And there was just a small piece about him. And I said, you guys should learn about him. First Black man to publish a book in the South. And that's when the teacher turned to me and kind of stage whispered, the school is named for him. And I didn't know that. And it wasn't like, boy, are you dumb? You're not from around here, are you? Because I know that one. It was more like, we don't really talk about that very much here. So that was a moment that just, well, I didn't know that, and I did feel foolish. And that started me on what I call my white ignorance journey, which is ongoing, where I'm trying to move from ignorance to understanding. And I understand more than I did.
Well, a lot of people are on that same journey with you, Marjorie, which is a big reason I want to have you on this podcast, and our previous guests attest to that. But I want to underline and just make sure I got this straight. You were already speaking at a school named for him and didn't know that. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. I've been dropping my girl off at soccer and talking to, my neighbors at PTA, and, just generally ignorantly walking around, not knowing that. Now, the interesting thing is when I started talking with my neighbors, especially the elders in my community, when I talked to Black elders in my community, they said, oh, yes, that's the George Moses Horton school. And why they knew that was because it had been a segregated school back to the 1920s. And it had only in the 1970s changed its name from the colored school to the Horton High School to the Horton Middle School. And they had never clarified who it was named for, and apparently spread a story about it being named for a white man. And of course, we hide information by naming things or not naming them. And so the story was just really not told in the school, perhaps as a legacy of discomfort with integration. And I said to myself, there is something really wrong about this. This man is extraordinary. He needs to be lifted up. He's so inspiring. He would inspire all of us. He inspires me, but also young people. So I set about trying to change that. I applied for a historic marker. I went to my county commissioners and had them proclaim George Moses Horton the historic poet laureate of Chatham County. And when placement of historic marker was delayed by the road widening, I was so discouraged because it was going to be placed the 200th year after he entered Chatham County at age 3. And I thought that would make a great tie-in for getting more attention for this story. So I was complaining and whinging about this to a couple of friends of mine, and one of them was Jackie Shelton Green, who is now our statewide poet laureate. And Jackie said to me, well, you need to just do something about it. And so I kind of really and truly said, well, what would George Moses Horton do? George Moses Horton would find allies and he would speak up. Well, I did that. I found some allies. I talked to my arts council, the local middle school, the Black History Society I'd been part of. I said, we're going to celebrate. Well, how about we celebrate this at the Horton Middle School and talk about who George Moses Horton was? So we had this big celebration in the year 2000. And I love that. And since that time, it's been 23 years, we have changed the name of the school to the George Moses Horton Middle School.
So there's no ambiguity. There's no ambiguity. Which Horton? Okay, yeah.
Right. And every year they have a George Moses Horton Day where they talk about Horton and celebrate him. Every child is given a children's book about George Moses Horton when they enter the school in 5th grade. And there are some legacies from the project. For example, there's what we call the Horton Freedom Path, which was made by students and artists in the community, which was a poetry path. We call it the On Summer Poetry Path, and each stone reflects a drawing from an image from one of George Moses Horton's poems on summer.
Well, before we keep going about what's happening now, let's go all the way back for why. I'm sure our listeners are wondering why he is getting so much attention. He published a couple of books, but what's the story? Why is it such a compelling story?
That's really, really good question. There's so much more to it. Well, first of all, George Moses Horton at a young age suffered from his family being divided along with an estate. He was in a situation where he was not able to see his family after a certain point. And you can see in his story that sparked some action on his part. He had loved since a young boy to write poetry in his head, but he didn't really know how to write it down. So we'd memorize things and kind of spout them. Well, as a teenager, after his family was split up, he got a kind of a part of his job became going to Chapel Hill to sell fruits and vegetables at the farmer's market. And while he was there, he would spout poetry. And the students were just enthralled. And because, Doug, as you know, the poetry is kind of extraordinary. It's insightful.
Why don't you read one? Why don't you read one or two for our listeners? Because the thing you just said about the division of the family, he's got a poem about that, right?
Yes.
Do you happen to have that one at your fingertips?
I do. And I'll just read a short section of it that is very, very moving. But oh, the state, the dark suspense in which poor vassals stand, each mind upon the spire of chance hangs, fluctuant. The day of separation is at hand. Imagination lifts her gloomy curtain like evening's mantle at the flight of day, through which the trembling pinnacle we spy, on which we soon must stand with hopeful smiles or apprehending frowns, to tumble on the right or left forever. So what he's talking about is this place that they would stand and be told, you're going this way, you're going that way. And
be separated from your siblings and your parents.
By sisters and brothers. And it was devastating. One of the cruelest aspects of slavery was that families were separated, sometimes over long, long distances.
Well, the part that is so stunning to me is the language. Where does a person who is enslaved on a farm in Chatham County come up with a line like "imagination lifts the gloomy curtain"? I mean, I wish I had written a line like that. So yes. You've got to illuminate for me how does that happen? Because I know that the college students he was entertaining apparently weren't writing verse of this quality.
That's right. They weren't, but they read verse of this quality, and they had many, many extra school books. They gave him books of Shakespeare and Socrates and all the great Aristotle and the great thinkers that, that might be kind of leftover books from their studies. And he devoured them because he by then had taught himself to read. And so this elevated language, which is not the language that either enslaved people or farm people or college boys were speaking, was the special language of poetry. And he mastered it. As we were talking about earlier, he mastered the language of the masters. Then he expressed what we needed to know from his world, thoughts that he needed to express. And that's an amazing intersection.
Well, it's very deep what you're saying here, because he's got an elevated language that he's using, and he's mastered the language of his masters and given us the lesson, really, that if you master the language, you become your own master.
Yes. In a way, he found his freedom through expression, and not to at all diminish the struggle of any person living in slavery. There, he found a wedge that allowed him some peace. And you can see that in any poet who's giving expression. A poet may be a tortured soul, but boy, if you read their poetry, the beauty and the insight is expressed there. And that's the creativity we need to fuel our world, in my view. So.
Well, that voice, whatever voice that is in that poem, is startling. It's just given the origins. He was going to the farmer's market and selling that. Well, no wonder he got some money for it.
Well, now let me just give you more background, because that was a poem that showed up in his first published book of poems. And he had some mentoring by then by a college professor's wife. What he sold at the farmer's market were love poems. Another extraordinary part of the story. The student said, well, the poems you're making up in your head are so amazing. Will you make one up about my girlfriend? And then I'll write it down and give it to her, and she will love me more. So he became a master of the acrostic form, mostly, where he would put the name of the lover on the vertically on the left, and then write certain lovely qualities of this person as told to him by the student. He would go back to the farm after his farmer's market time, and he would do his work, which was mostly tending cattle. And he was so bored. So he would invent things in his head, memorize them, because he still did not know how to write them down.
Wow.
And then the next week, dictate them to the student, who would give him 25 cents, 50 cents, a lot of money in those days. Sometimes he made $4 a week. It became such a popular endeavor.
In the 1850s, he was making $4 a week.
Yes.
Isn't that real money? That's real money. Like that's white person's money. I mean, to say it that way. Yeah.
And indeed, it became part of his strategy. He used some of that money to buy his time. That was what it was called, from his master, so that he could spend time This was later on in Chapel Hill on the campus. He became a fixture on the UNC campus.
It's amazing. So let me get this straight. He could be an enslaved person belonging to someone, but if he independently could generate income, he could buy his moments of freedom, like the ability to go somewhere on his own for the day and not be, whipped or made to go back or anything. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. And, this was actually fairly common for skilled laborers who were blacksmiths or seamstresses or people who had special skills, carpenters. They would perhaps be farmed out, and the money they would give to their master. So they were away from the farm, but and they were able to express their skill in other ways. So it was just. It was poetry.
Well, it is, and in a way we could have two reactions to that and say, oh, well, so slavery wasn't that bad. They could get away and do what they wanted to do. On the other hand, you could say, how horrible is that? That even if you had freedom, you knew you could never ever get away. And as far as you got away, they would always bring you back, and things would be worse for you after you got back.
Yes, and your family could still be sold and sent away. And, there was nothing really truly free about it. It was sort of like tenant farming that followed up on the enslaved times. Was a form of slavery where the workers never really got to move forward from their own energies and their own efforts. So, it was a wedge, though. It was. Yeah,
it really was, and it's just remarkable that he achieved something that enables two white people to be speaking about him intimately in the year 2023. What an achievement. What an incredible achievement.
Right. And, history one of the things that's really interesting to me is that we don't really have an oral tradition in our histories. That's happening more now, but history is only considered authentic or real if it's published or written down. And he was able to do that. We have a window into his world because he published his autobiography, and he published 3 books of poems that are, deeply autobiographical and thoughtful. And so we have a window into historic time, a kind of a proof for his life because it is published. So,
well, it's very interesting that you tell the story about what he was able to make money off of at the farmer's market, and that people would pay for a poem. It's hard for us to imagine that today, that we would go and have to buy a poem, except if we think about a poem as a song that we're going to sing, because we certainly pay for that, and the other person who understood what George Moses Horton understood was Chuck Berry. Because he understood that if you could write it down, he could play, and a lot of people could play guitar, but if he could write the song down, people would pay for that. And people would pay him over and over again for that. He could sell the same song over and over again and make money on it for the rest of his life. All he had to do was be able to write a 3-minute song. And I certainly spent a lot of my youth spending my money on poems, you could say. Short poems, and I would go out of my way to get them, and then spend all my spare time listening to them. So I think it's the same impulse. Like he understood that, love poems for young people are very popular and in demand, and you could make some money off of that.
Yeah, he certainly did understand that. But the other way he made his money was he became strategic, and with the help of his ally, Caroline Lee Hentz, who was, an influential woman on the UNC campus. Wow. He was able to learn to write his poems down, and his more far-reaching poems, his thoughtful poems about slavery, about freedom, about the poetic muse, the poems that expressed his deepest inner life. He wrote them down, and she sent some of them to journals for abolitionists. She sent some of them to her local journal where she was from, and he was published. And then they put together this idea of selling a book of poems on consignment. That was or on subscription, excuse me. People would subscribe to a book based on the promise of a book, and then would receive a book when it was completed. So the idea was to make money from that as a venture, capitalist venture. And somehow, because I guess he had allies helping him, they were able to handle all the production and the money that might come from that. And so that was his dream. And it spread the word about him. He became a cause in the abolition movement. Newspaper editors and governors and university presidents stood up for him and attempted to supplement the amount he made, which wasn't enough, in order to purchase his freedom. And his master always raised the price. So it was a deeply, he did it a second time. He wrote a second book of poem, and that also did not work. So the strategy of buying his time by selling poems individually ended up being the wedge that gave him freedom during his, modicum of freedom during his enslaved time. And he attended classes. He became, a learner on campus, and the stories told that he lectured to a class. And I know he wrote about the joys of learning. He wrote a book, a poem I love about learning about zoology and oceanography and all these things that he'd never seen but had learned and listened to. And that's what writers do. We pay attention. And so he was paying attention and expressing how his mind engaged with all the things he was learning.
Well, how can people find Horton's work?
Yeah, they can find it online. He has collected, one of his poems is in the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. There are several books published that have his work in them. One is a scholarly book called The Black Bard of North Carolina by editor is Joan Sherman. And then there's a facsimile reproduction of his last book, modestly named Naked Genius, which collects a lot of the poems that he wrote later in his life and after freedom when he was traveling with Union soldiers. He writes about Lincoln. He writes about the war between North and South. He writes about his insights. And I just can imagine that he was writing love poems for the Union soldiers as they traveled as well.
Yes, I imagine. And is there one more that you want to read to illustrate any of those to us?
He's writing about himself and his poetic muse here. So I'll just read a few lines from, and I believe this is from Naked Genius. It's called George Moses Horton